I've struggled getting out of bed some days because what do you do with yourself when your whole world turns upside down?
We lost 90% of our revenue overnight.
2020 was the year that changed just about everything. The coronavirus pandemic affected how we live and how we work. It upended our social lives, changed our shopping habits, and impacted how and where we could travel.
I think this is by far the biggest crisis we have ever faced, and clearly requires us to take very quick and deep action.
For the country, it led to the biggest economic slump in a generation, causing thousands of people to lose their jobs across the UK. And so as we grapple with its impacts on our lives and our livelihoods, we'll assess how long it could take for the country to recover. And amid all of this turmoil, we wonder whether COVID has given us reason to stop, to reassess, and perhaps to do things differently.
People have realised that they can actually work from home, they can have a better work-life balance.
Sweeping and extraordinary measures to deal with coronavirus, the forced closure of pubs, restaurants and gyms, and an unprecedented rescue package for workers and businesses.
The Prime Minister announces the toughest restrictions on daily life in living memory.
There are just no easy options. The way ahead is hard.
And for business, it began here. A national lockdown forced the closure of all but essential retailers. Office workers stayed at home, balancing laptops on kitchen tables. Fewer commuters meant empty trains. There was less stress for some, but more for others, those battling noisy neighbours or even noisier children.
My name is Christian.
His name's Christian.
Christian? Yes.
Video calls became the norm, testing our Wi-Fi and our patience to the limit.
Let's see if I can turn this up. Carrie, just talk to me a bit more.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I was appalled when I kept hearing people in government and elsewhere saying we have to get back to work, as if we haven't been working. I mean, this COVID period, we've been working longer and harder than ever before.
Those who couldn't work from home faced entirely different challenges. With their businesses shut, factory workers, shop staff and those working in bars, restaurants and hotels found themselves out of work. Their wages were paid instead by the government from the support scheme we came to know as furlough.
I am placing no limit on the amount of funding available for the scheme. We will pay grants to support as many jobs as necessary.
The furlough scheme was intended to be a temporary fix to a short-term problem, designed to discourage employers from laying off staff and to see them through the worst of the lockdown. But its extension means that the scheme will have been running for a whole year. Since launching in March, more than 9 million workers have had their wages subsidised through the furlough scheme at a cost of over £40 billion. Alongside other measures to tackle the crisis, the total cost has hit more than £200 billion. But with government income squeezed as tax receipts from workers and businesses fell, the government was forced to borrow more to cover the cost. The government's likely to borrow more than £370 billion for the whole of this financial year. It's a level never seen before in the UK, except during 2 world wars.
I've struggled getting out of bed some days because what do you do with yourself when your whole world turns upside down?
Yet despite the cost, those schemes didn't help everyone. People like Mark Whittaker, who started a curtain fitting business whilst still employed, but he didn't earn enough in the last tax year to qualify for the income support scheme that was introduced to help self-employed workers.
Don't make me beg for it. You didn't make anybody else beg for it. Why are you making me beg for it? It's not fair, for goodness sake.
how important were government measures, things like grants and loans to business? And of course, that job scheme, the furlough scheme, the Chancellor was very clear that he couldn't save every business or every job.
Well, the furlough scheme certainly left a lot of people behind. A lot of people who are self-employed, who didn't have enough of a tax return history to be able to submit it, couldn't then verify their incomes. Some individuals who are part employed and part self-employed also fell through the cracks. And worse still are the individuals that are still building their business and therefore were reinvesting their income into their business and therefore didn't have an income to declare for themselves. They were also left unsupported.
And those individual stories tell us what's happening in the wider economy. With businesses closed and workers stuck at home, the economy shrank by more than 20% in the months after lockdown. It was the biggest fall in GDP on record. By the end of April, the economy was a quarter smaller than it was before the crisis began. Unemployment, meanwhile, began to creep higher, slowly at first, cushioned by the furlough scheme, but gathered speed as a recession took hold. Forecasts say the jobless rate could hit 7.5%, with more than 2.5 million people out of work by the middle of next year.
Compared to our peers, especially across Europe, the UK has been the second worst performer in terms of the where we are in terms of GDP compared to the pre-crisis level. A lot of this is to do with the high exposure to services and the reliance on household spending for economic growth. But in addition, it's also been the length of the lockdown. Most European countries had far shorter lockdown, but the UK's restrictions lasted well into the summer. So that inevitably had a negative impact as well.
And that could hit younger people the hardest. Reggie Nelson works in the city and mentors people looking to start their careers. But for those aged between 16 and 24, the jobless rate is 3 times higher than average, and particularly affects those from poorer economic backgrounds.
Just to paint a picture, you've got young people living at home, they're probably house sharing, they're probably sharing a room with siblings if they have any. If there are monetary challenges, then their parents are trying to work to keep up with the electric and the Wi-Fi and all of those things combined. And you have to remember, some of them might not even have working devices or slow devices. Young people going into a market that is already competitive, COVID has just made that even more competitive, and trying to navigate that while studying and not having that certainty of a career, I think has just made it a lot more challenging.
What are your hopes for 2021? And I know it's a tough question, isn't it? No one knows what's going to happen, but what are you advising young people about what next year might look like?
So what I'm telling my young people is, this won't last forever, but also to use this time to upskill, use this time to develop your skill set, find out what you want to do, build your network so that when things do return to a more normal state, you're in the best position to leverage off that and to utilize that. I think institutions now are definitely seeing how they can become more agile, more nimble. They want different thoughts, they want diversity of thoughts as well. And young people can definitely bring that because they bring a new dynamic in thinking.
But just how long will it take for the economy and jobs to recover? Well, that depends on how long it takes for normal life to resume, dictated by the mass rollout of a vaccine. And as England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland enforce their own restrictions, firms are learning to respond and adapt on a more local level. But fears of additional lockdowns not only impact our ability to work, shop and socialise, but also our outlook on the economy and our willingness to spend again. And that can't come soon enough for the ailing hospitality industry. It's been one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. Pubs, bars, restaurants and hotels all bore the brunt of the lockdown restrictions, despite spending millions on new safety measures to protect customers and staff. Social settings were still blamed for helping spread the virus.
Places rely on a high footfall, they've got incredibly low margins. In city centres like London, they've struggled to get into double-digit revenues this year.
Kate Nichols represents hospitality firms and says the industry, which employs more than 4 million people in the UK, has been unfairly penalised by the restrictions.
Our stock has gone to waste. We've literally poured the beer down the drains because it's no longer good to serve. So it costs you money in stock every time you open and close those doors, so that this constant yo-yo costs the industry money.
With the number of hospital admissions and deaths falling by the summer, bars and restaurants were able to reopen. But with fewer tables, restrictions on numbers, and new measures to limit the spread of the virus, it wasn't business as usual.
Can I just check the temperature?
The government encouraged us back out too, with its Eat Out to Help Out scheme, offering cut-price meals.
2 of these for less than a £5. 2 meals for less than a £5, you can't go wrong.
I went back to the manager, said I made a mistake here. He said, no, it's not a mistake, it's half price.
Its success took many by surprise. The month-long programme served up more than 160 million meals.
I think the industry sees that as a good policy that was designed to boost consumer confidence. It wasn't just about eating out, it was about getting people back into the high street, getting them back to work, getting them on public transport, and it worked. If you look around, consumer confidence hasn't taken a knock during this second lockdown. The only thing that they've not been able to do is come and enjoy hospitality safely.
Just how angry are the owners of pubs and restaurants and bars that once again they are not able to reopen, even though perhaps gyms and conference centres and sports venues can reopen?
The industry feels hard done by because it is now identified as the only area subject to restrictions. So you can go to the gym, you can go shopping, and you can't go to a pub and have a drink with a friend.
We know this is a time of year when many businesses make the majority of their money, the money that will see them through the rest of the year. Will they all reopen in January or February, if indeed they can?
It's a very bleak winter for the industry, and I think there's about 1.5 million jobs in hospitality alone, let alone our supply chain, that could be at risk because we don't have that cushion of profit from December's trading to get us through to Easter.
There was confusion too, with hairdressers allowed to reopen in some parts of the country in July, but nail salons and beauty spas were forced to stay closed for longer. Their close contact treatments were deemed too risky, despite screens, masks and visors. And by November, many were forced to close again, as additional restrictions were brought in to stem a growing second wave of infections. Elsewhere, theatres, music venues, events and exhibitions remain in the dark about their chances of reopening. Most need to sell at least 60% of their tickets just to pay the bills. But with social distancing, curfews and limits on group gatherings, many warn that's just not viable.
We are going to have to save theatre, save the arts and save the jobs.
It leaves hundreds of thousands of actors, musicians, technicians and backstage staff without work. A government grant worth more than £1.5 billion was designed to offer support, but the industry says more is needed. Many smaller regional venues that rely on touring productions have closed for good. And whilst London's Theatreland is showing signs of life as restrictions begin to ease, not all the bright lights will come back on. And so whilst the future for places like this remains unclear, for retail there was a reprieve. Shops were able to reopen and salvage some of the year in the lucrative run-up to Christmas. But for others that came too late. Many familiar names disappeared from our high streets this year, and then in December came the collapse of 2 giants of retail.
More jobs at risk on the high street as Arcadia's administration leads to more trouble at Debenhams.
12,000 jobs are likely to disappear from the high street as Debenhams goes out of business.
In many ways, this is the worst week for high street retail that we've ever seen.
Even before the pandemic, high street stores were contending with online rivals. But as COVID closed non-essential retail, those without a website or business disappear overnight. It was a painful contrast to the panic buying that emptied supermarket shelves amid soaring sales of toilet roll, flour, eggs and pasta.
Absolute nightmare, to be perfectly honest. Not a lot on the shelves left.
No toilet roll at all.
It's been a roller coaster. I never imagined that I would end up doing a story about loo roll, how much we produce of it for the national news. But in a way, that's how the pandemic for me started to unfold in retail, because we all knew that the lockdown was brewing. So what did lots of people do? They made a dash to the shops to stockpile. When the lockdown came, the high street effectively shut. Those town centres so eerily quiet, and for the high street retailers, those sales just evaporated overnight. They went into crisis mode.
Some would say the pandemic has just speeded up change that was happening already. There was a big move online. The high street was already struggling. Is that how you see it? This has just brought forward the change.
Parts of retail were in turmoil before lockdown because of the shift online, but meanwhile they still had the fixed costs of all the shops. So if the spending shifted online, the economics of running all these stores, they were grappling with, and lots of businesses were either going into administration, doing restructuring, closing shops. But now the pandemic, as I say, has speeded up what's already happening. And I think a lot of the weaker players, when this pandemic struck, exposed their problems even more. And that's why we've seen a whole string of businesses fall over.
And Emma, is there any reason that we can be optimistic or hopeful about retail next year? Because things are likely to look very different, aren't they?
A lot of people think the high street is dead. It's not. It's just changing. We know that there is too much retail space in the UK. We're talking about a reinvention of our high streets and town centres. And of course, who's going to fill the gaps? The residential, workspace, civic amenity, independent retailers who have tended to do or survive this pandemic a bit better than the big chains. So there's hope there. It's just changing very quickly.
I thought that we'd be saved, but not this time. Sorry.
2020 also disrupted our travel plans. Flybe was an early casualty, a sign of the hardship to come across the travel industry. It collapsed in early March, before lockdown even began. It was already struggling, but with travellers put off flying, bookings had slumped, and its network of regional connections was severed. 2,000 jobs were lost. Then came cruising, in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons.
We haven't stepped out of this cabin since we were quarantined on the 4th of February.
Infections aboard several ships left them turned away from ports, unable to offload passengers. The Diamond Princess, just one of 40 ships with infected passengers, all of them confined to their cabins.
Governments around the world didn't know what to do, and they didn't want to allow ships to dock and perhaps let passengers off into their communities. And so the ships, were really put in a spotlight, but dealt with it very well. And actually, the cruise industry has probably done more than any other sector of travel, more than hotels or airlines, etc., to make sure that it really is safe from health and safety and hygiene, from testing. They're committed to testing everybody before boarding ships. So they're ready to restart. But unfortunately, the Foreign Office advice is that Brits still can't take an ocean cruise. So it's very tough times for the cruise industry.
Closer to home, as the first national lockdown began, so too did a ban on all but essential travel. Trains and stations lay eerily quiet. A massive government bailout designed to keep near-empty trains running for key workers essentially nationalised the network. Restrictions also left holiday plans in ruins, planes grounded, hotels empty. travel firms were deluged with requests for refunds. Some offered vouchers instead, prompting fury from customers who demanded their money back.
We're just chasing them, we just keep asking them, please, 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 will you refund us?
Obviously they wanted to look after their customers, but they just couldn't. When you buy a holiday, you give the money to your travel agent or your tour operator, and that goes on to the suppliers in the chain. So they had to wait for that money to come back down the chain in order to pass it back to the customer. And so, it was a really, really tough time.
Even when restrictions were eased at home, foreign getaways remained out of reach. With borders all but closed, the holiday hotspots in Spain, Italy and Greece lay empty as Brits holidayed a little closer to home. By July, so-called travel corridors were opened between countries with low infection rates. It gave the industry a much-needed boost, but with destinations added and removed from the list every week, booking a trip became a gamble at best.
500,000 Britons are thought to be in France right now. They face a scramble to get home on flights, ferries and trains here at St Pancras.
And so it's no wonder that travel firms have struggled. BA, just one of the giants forced to ground thousands of flights. It laid off 10,000 staff. Its boss told me in July that COVID was a crisis never before seen in the industry.
It's a very worrying time for everybody, but I think the figures speak for themselves. This is the deepest crisis. This is by far the biggest loss. British Airways will lose, or has lost more in one quarter than the record loss it made in a year in history. So, these are really extreme times.
So what happens next? Well, with more meetings now done online, the days of long-distance business travel may be over. And with a looming recession, budgets may be squeezed too. And for consumers, after months of lockdown, demand to get away may bounce back. But with disposable incomes also feeling the pressure, the travel industry is in for a rough ride. How long will it take for things to get back to something resembling normality?
I'm really hopeful it will get back. It's going to take some time. I mean, many companies were reporting record years in 2019, and it's going to take a while to get back to that. Certainly the signs are strong demand for the second half of 2021 and beyond. I think people have been cooped up at home, and they're now thinking, well, when I get out, I'm going to do something really good. So they're looking at longer duration, sort of bucket list holidays. I think that it will come back. The problem is, which companies are going to be there by that time in order to be able to take them.
And could the same be true of our town and city centres? Will we ever work in quite the same way again? Is the daily commute for office workers really a thing of the past?
There's no way that we're not going to have a central office environment. We'll work substantially from home, but come into the office a couple days a week because we need to for a whole variety. So the notion it's gone entirely, I think, is wrong.
And that's because offices are where there is collaboration, where there's teamwork and creativity. Our town and city centres need them too. The bars, the shops, the cafes and the restaurants that have sprung up to serve the morning coffee, the lunches with colleagues and the after-work drinks. Psychologists say it's all too easy for working from home to become living at work.
We have much more personal disposable time. Drop the 2 hours or 2.5 or 3 hours a day commuting. That's wonderful to get rid of that. Here's the worry I have, Ben. The worry in the future is, will people manage their time properly? And I'm just worried. The evidence is if you consistently work long hours, you will get ill and you'll be less productive. So I have worries about that we have to learn how to do this. Yes, we are learning now. COVID has forced us. It's a big learning experiment. However, we have to clock off at some point in time.
For many, 2020 was a year to forget, professionally, socially and financially. The vaccine offers a hope of a return to something more normal. But how long does that take? And what even is normal anymore? Coronavirus has changed the way we live and the way we work. It's made us reassess what is important. But perhaps the true impact of this pandemic will only be felt many, many years from now.